Math 1332, Chapter 3, Symbolic Logic, Section 4, Logical Arguments, Video 10, Common Fallacies, Fallacy of the Inclusive Or. We have one more fallacy to go over, and then we'll have one more video after this just demonstrating a few examples so that you won't know which common argument form or which fallacy is in front of you, and you'll have to deduce it. But for this one, let's consider the following premises. Premise 1. We will go to the movies or we will go to dinner. Premise number 2, we went to dinner. Can you draw a conclusion? And of course, is that conclusion valid? You should already know the answer to the second part. Well, let's think about it. I said we will go to the movies or we will go to dinner. And then later it's found out that we went to dinner. So can you conclude anything about the movies? Well, the most common conclusion to draw is we did not go to the movies. But is it possible for the conclusion to be false if both premises were true? If so, this is an invalid argument form. Well, is it possible for me to say we will go to the movies or we will go to dinner, being a true statement, and then we go to dinner, being a true statement, but then we also go to the movies? If we go to the movies, does that violate the first premise? Actually, no, it doesn't. So is it possible for the conclusion to be false if both premises were true? The answer is yes. Remember that logically the disjunction is an inclusive or. That means both halves can be true. It's the old analogy of if a college says, to get admission, you must score a 1,500 on the SAT or a 30 on the ACT. If you do both, are they going to turn you away? Of course not. Hopefully, they would give you more scholarship money. But it isn't the exclusive or, which means either this or that, but not both. That's like you're at a restaurant and they say, well, tonight's special, $12.95, steak or lobster. So do you want steak or lobster? And if you say yes, I want both, they'll say, no, you can have one or the other, but not both. That's the exclusive or. But in general, logic is the inclusive or. Now, some of you might have been wondering once upon a time or even now, is there a symbol for the exclusive or? And the answer is no, because there's not the need for one. But if you're curious, how would you write either this or that, but not both? I challenge you to try to write the symbolic representation of that, or contact me and I'll let you in on it. But that's the mistake most people make here, is they assume that the or is always an exclusive or. Oh, sorry, gave it away. So why do so many people incorrectly draw this conclusion? Because most people incorrectly assume that or is always exclusive. In other words, that or always means either or, but not both. Because people sometimes draw an invalid conclusion by assuming this, this argument form is called the fallacy of the inclusive or. They're making an incorrect assumption about the inclusive or, namely that it's an exclusive or. Nothing to see here. So I introduce you to common fallacy number 3. Number 3, the fallacy of the inclusive or. Symbolically, it goes something like this. Your first premise is a disjunction. Now, earlier I mentioned in a different video that for most of these forms, the first argument is a conditional. In fact, of the 4 common valid argument forms and the 3 common fallacies, 5 of them start with a conditional. These are the law of detachment, law of contraposition, and the law of syllogism. And in the fallacies, it's the fallacy of the inverse and the fallacy of the converse. The other 2, make sure I don't use the wrong fingers here. My hand disappeared. The other 2 do not start with a conditional. They start with a disjunction. There is a common valid argument form and a common fallacy that both start with the disjunction. In the argument form, in the valid one, it's the law of disjunctive syllogism. And in the fallacy column, it is the fallacy of the inclusive or. So if you're trying to identify an argument to an argument form, start by looking at the first premise and see if it's a conditional or if it's a disjunction. And if it's one of those two, then you can start narrowing down your choices. Now, the fallacy of the inclusive or goes like this. Let's say that you start with some sort of disjunction, P or Q. And the second premise is the first statement, P. The incorrect conclusion that people draw is that the conclusion is the negation of the other statement, because they are incorrectly assuming that the or means either or but not both. So if you have one, you can't have the other, hence the negation on the conclusion. Now, just like the law of disjunctive syllogism, the fallacy of the inclusive or can be written a different way as well symbolically, because the second premise doesn't have to be the first statement in the disjunction. It could also be the case that your first premise is a disjunction, so P disjunction Q, but your second premise is the second statement in that disjunction, and the conclusion is not the first statement, but its negation. But they both have the same structure in that the first premise is a disjunction, the second premise is one of the disjunction statements, and the conclusion is the negation of the other statement, which is why the descriptive form for the fallacy of the inclusive or is premise number one is statement one or statement two. Premise number two is one of these statements, and the conclusion is the negation of the other statement. It doesn't matter if the second statement is premise one or premise two, as long as the conclusion is the negation of the other statement, you have fallen for the fallacy of the inclusive or. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Determine if the following is a valid argument. Premise one, you better pay me my money or I'll sue you. Premise number two, you paid me my money. Conclusion, I won't sue you. Valid conclusion? Let's analyze the structure of the argument. The first premise is a disjunction whose first statement is, you better pay me my money, and whose second statement is, I'll sue you. The second premise is, you paid me my money, which is the past tense of the first statement in the disjunction, but that's okay. Tenses can change. It's still the same statement. And the conclusion is not the second statement in the disjunction, but its negation because of the word won't. This is precisely the argument form for the fallacy of the inclusive or. Look at the colors and look at the colors on the first one, the one up here. Yellow, green, yellow, negation, green. Yellow, green, yellow, negation, green. This is the fallacy of the inclusive or. Thus, the argument is invalid. Oh, why would they sue me? I paid you my money. Well, yeah, well, maybe you crashed into their car and you won't pay up, and now they're going to sue you for that. So remember, or does not mean either or, but not both. Not in symbolic logic. Or is inclusive. It allows the possibility that both halves are true. He could pay me my money, and I could sue him, maybe for a different reason. Maybe he didn't pay me all my money. I don't know. Let's take a look at one that's already symbolic in nature. Determine if the following argument is valid. Look at that mess of stuff. Premise one, R biconditional negation Q, or Q and negation P. Premise two, Q and negation P. Well, didn't I just say that? Conclusion, the negation of R biconditional negation Q. On the surface, this doesn't look like any common form. But the fact that the first premise is a disjunction means that there are two possible forms it could match. The valid form being the law of disjunctive syllogism, The fallacy being the fallacy of the inclusive or. Analyze the structure of the argument so that you can compare it to see if it matches a common argument form. Because the first premise is a disjunction, it has a first statement on the left and a second statement on the right. Now let's look at the next premise. The next premise exactly matches the second statement on the right, Q and negation P. Look at the conclusion. The conclusion is almost the first statement in the first premise, except it's the negation of it. This is precisely the second version of the symbolic representation of the fallacy of the inclusive or. Look at the colors, left to right, top to bottom. Yellow, green, green, negation yellow. Yellow, green, green, negation yellow. This is precisely the fallacy of the inclusive or, therefore this argument is invalid. To summarize, the fallacy of the inclusive or says the following is an invalid argument form. Symbolically, there are two versions of it. I'm not going to highlight all the individual pieces. I am going to move stuff around accidentally. But both of the symbolic forms say the same thing. Your first premise is a disjunction, an or statement. Your second premise is half of that or statement. The conclusion is the negation of the other half, which is precisely what this descriptive form says. First premise is statement 1 or statement 2. Premise 2 is one of those two statements. The conclusion is the negation of the other statement. Any argument that has any of these forms is considered invalid. You cannot draw that conclusion.